Hi, friends, fellow evolvers, and curious people everywhere. Welcome to this episode of Being with Sally Wilson. I'm Sally Wilson, and I feel so lucky to have Katrina Nannestad as my guest today. She has celebrity status in our family. Probably hates me saying that, but welcome, Katrina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today, Sally.
Oh, I'm so excited. And my niece is very excited. My mother's very excited. The whole family's very excited. Listeners and viewers, I'll tell you why. So several months ago, my niece came to me and said, Auntie Sal, you need to read this book. And I said, oh, really? Do I? She's 11 years old, by the way. I said, why do I need to read this book? And she said, because it's really good. And I went on then to read We Are Wolves, which is one of the books written by Katrina, and I was hooked. So, Katrina, you have given, as I said in my email when we first met, when I first got in touch with you, you have given 3 generations of women in our family such joy through your stories. So thank you.
Oh no, thank you. Thank you for all reading them. That just warms my heart so much to know that about the 3 generations reading my books. That's really special.
Absolutely. And I know that your audience is children, but I was never aware. There was never the sense of awareness that this is written for a child. It felt relevant to anybody and was just gripping. I mean, I've read 3 of your books now, We Are Wolves and Waiting for the Storks. Have I got that title right? Waiting for the Storks.
Yeah.
And Rabbit Soldier,
Angel Thief.
Angel Thief. Yep. And they were all absolute page turners, which I just couldn't put down. And, you know, your ability, what is your story with writing, Katrina? Because I know that when you were 10, you had your first attempt at writing and you're like, oh no, I don't really, not gonna do this. And then something later on sparked your love for stories again. How did all that happen?
Yeah, well, that thing about my 10-year-old attempt was really only because I got a typewriter. I had no interest in becoming a writer. I actually didn't even like reading books as a kid. I think I was shown, I'm 55 years old. So when I was a kid, a lot of books for kids were quite earnest. And, you know, people love Enid Blyton. I hated Enid Blyton's books. I really didn't find them interesting. I read comics because I like humour and colour. So thank goodness for comics, or I might never have learnt to read very well. But my love for stories really came about when I was a teenager, and I finally found my way to some books that I could actually enjoy. And particularly a real change in my life came in year 11 and 12 at school when I had a brilliant English teacher. And up until that stage, I'd been really pretty much a maths science student and had planned to pursue that sort of course after school. But my English teacher was just passionate about literature. And, you know, when someone's really passionate about someone, you catch that enthusiasm. I really did. And so much so that I went on to study literature at university, and then I became a teacher. But by that stage, I was hooked on stories and books. And as I was teaching, my favourite part of every day was sharing stories with my students. I just love the magic of a well-written story to drag everyone in together into a new world. Like, you know, it could be something you escape to on your own, or if you're sharing a story with a class, the whole class could disappear into that beautiful world of the story. And then also when I had my own children, I just used to love snuggling up on the lounge with them and reading picture books. And again, that magic of the book, the story, that we could all escape together. And even when the last page is shut on a good story, that it lives on in your thoughts and your imagination, and with children, that it lives on in what they talk about and the words they use. So I think it was all that absolute magic of story that I started to appreciate from the end of my schooling years with that great teacher through to my experience of sharing stories with children that truly got me inspired and wanting to create my own version of that kind of story magic for children.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that you just mentioned, a well-written story. So
Yeah.
how do we become really great writers. I mean, because everyone, often I think people think it's just like musicians. You know, people often say to my husband, who's a pianist, oh, I'd love to be able to just sit down and play like that. You know, and there's actually a very long process usually involved in getting to that level. So, you know, what is that process like?
Well, I think you've probably hit the nail on the head there with that funny thing that people say, I'd love to just be able to sit down and play the piano. Or people often say, I'd love to write children's books when I retire. And but when you talk to them, they're actually not writing at all now, which is fine. And they might be able to sit down and do something brilliant immediately when they retire. But for me, it was a practice thing. And I always talk to children about that. When I first started writing, I wasn't very good. I got one of my first books I wrote got published, and I thought, oh, I'm so good at this. I'm so clever. I've really got what it takes. And then for the next 9 years, everything I wrote and sent into my publisher was rejected. And
9 years.
Yes, 9 years. And it wasn't that I wasn't just hitting the spot for the market at that time. I look over at those stories and I'm so embarrassed that I sent them in because they weren't well written. But what happened over those 9 years, because I liked writing and kept writing, I got practice and I got better at writing. And of course, I've always been reading, so I take note of what makes a phrase or a story or a character come to life and try to apply that in my own writing. So it was just that learning from other people's work and practicing. And the more you practice any skill, the better you get at it, don't you? I mean, you know that from your career as an opera singer. You don't just wake up one morning and go, I would love to stand on the stage and be an opera singer, and you put on your best dress and you go on stage and hope for the best. It doesn't work like that. And writing's the same. It's a skill. I often say that to kids, you know, you don't wake up and think, right, I'm going to run in the 100-metre sprint in the Olympics today and fall out of bed, put your runners on and hope for the best. It's anything, a skill like writing, singing, sport, you practice. And that's basically what it was with me. I just practiced so much, and so I reframe my rejection years as my practice years.
It sounds kind of like an apprenticeship years. That's really interesting. It just brought to mind what you said. Just brought to mind. I remember, you know, being dragged off to a cricket camp that was my brother's cricket camp when we were kids, and some of the amazing West Indian players were there teaching these kids.
Oh, wow.
And they said to them, I can't remember which player it was, but he said to them, practice is good, but practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And I think we don't want to all be perfectionists and hold ourselves back here, but it's also, as you said, you know, a part of your process was reading what you thought brought characters to life in other people's books and stories, and analyzing and learning and studying it and perfecting those elements, you know, in an I guess an intelligent sort of strategic way, not just.
Well, I suppose that's. Yeah, and I suppose that's what if people do, there are wonderful writing courses out there now, and I didn't ever really. I don't know whether I didn't know about them or I certainly didn't ever consider doing a writing course. I mean, I'd done an arts degree in literature, and so there was a fair bit of writing in that. So I suppose in that way I'd done some training in writing. But really what those courses would do would be the same thing as you can do when you're self-taught with anything, you know, in learning from others. But it was a fairly long apprenticeship.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And one of the things that I find a really interesting juxtaposition in the books of yours that I've read is that these three books are based in war situations. So that the protagonists are children, and a lot of them, and they're based in war situations. And yet your writing is such a celebration of connection and joy and friendship and love and humor that you manage to bring into these stories that are just based in really actually horrific circumstances.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Wow, that's a big question. I think I've always tried to write the sorts of stories I wish were available to me as a child, or in a way that I feel would have engaged me as a child. So I'm always keeping my child audience in mind. And I think that's really important, because then if you're writing to children, and I think this is the case for adults too, I think everyone really needs a sense of hope in a story. I think you need to, particularly writing with children, I think you need to leave children with a sense of hope at the end of a story, and give a sense of hope and connection throughout the story. And so that's always foremost in my mind. And I think, like in writing for children, I'm always aware that even though I'm dealing with dark topics, I need to make it age appropriate for children, and I need to make it accessible, and I also need to make it entertaining. If we're realistic about it, a novel is not primarily for education, it's for entertainment. And in entertaining and getting your audience in, of course you can change people's minds about things and inform them. That's the power of an historical novel, of course. But I'm always aware that I have to relate to children. And so in doing that, I think of, well, what's important? What do children need in their lives? And we all, children and adults, we all need community. We all need family. We need friends. We need to feel loved and safe and important. And of course, in a war story, that safety and often that family and community is gone. But the way I see my characters surviving and making it through is that along the way they find other people who are being their family in place of family they've lost, being their friends, often surprising people who they would think was their enemy. And because I do think those things are important to us all. And as you read stories, real stories of survival, often it's those chance encounters, or those encounters where someone is kind and puts themselves out, that actually makes the difference between survival and death in those really extreme situations. Yeah. I think I'm going around in circles. I'm not really answering the question, but
I don't know that my question was really fully answerable. I mean, it's such a big, but one of the things also that really struck me about those 3 books, and I don't know whether you sort of had the seed of the idea of all of them when you started the first one, did you? Or
no, actually, I hadn't even planned to write the story about the Wolfskinder. That was just a bit of a chance encounter. I was looking for another war story that I thought was true in Denmark that turned out not to be what I thought it was. But in looking there, I came across a Danish online newspaper that talked about an article about the Wolfskinder now, which obviously is an aging population and a disappearing population. And I didn't know who they were, so I read about the Wolfskinder and was fascinated. And I just gave an offhanded comment to my publisher saying, "Oh, have you heard about these? This is a fascinating story." Not really thinking, "Oh, I need to write this." And she wrote back and said, "Oh, yeah, that does sound fascinating. Send us in your idea when it's fully developed." So I thought, I better develop the idea. So that's sort of really was a happy accident for me, because it started me on this path of writing war stories. So while I was researching werewolves, I was looking up things about Hitler Youth and the role of children being forced into doing things during the war that children should never be asked to do, that nobody should be asked to do, really. And then I came across stories about child soldiers, which is where I got the idea for the story of Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief. And by that stage, my publisher said, "Well, we really need to make it 3 books to round it out, and it needs to be a lesser-known story again." And she'd found this story about the Lebensborn program that she said, "What about this? Does this interest you?" So it was really all a bit of a happy accident. But now I love writing that sort of novel, the research writing, and I'll continue to write those sorts of stories along with the other lighter stories I write.
Yeah. Oh, good. Because the main question my niece had for you is, are you going to write a story based in the Ukraine?
Oh, yeah, a few children have been asking me that. I don't know. There might be one that's set in World War II in the Ukraine. I've had an interesting discussion last year during Book Week. I came across a few children who had family who'd come out from what was Yugoslavia, Bosnia and those areas during that war in the 80s and the 90s. And they said, oh, have you thought of writing about that? And I was talking to one of the librarians at the school who'd come from Bosnia. And I said, I feel like there are people who are alive today and have lived that firsthand, and it's their story to tell because they're still there to tell the story. Okay. And I suppose I feel a little bit like that with Ukraine as well. If there are people who've experienced that, I think the reason I feel happy to tell World War II stories that aren't my stories because a lot of these people aren't around still to tell these stories. And if they haven't been told now, well, it's maybe up to someone who's not connected to tell that story. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, I never say never though. And interestingly, the librarian said to me, I would be happy for someone like you who has writing skills to tell this story. She said, it's my story, but I'm not a writer. So that was interesting too, to get that balance. It's really important that we let people tell their own stories if they're able to. But she was saying, well, maybe though we need someone who's a writer to tell that story for us. So there's always that sort of delicate balance as a writer, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Another of the wonderful things that really struck me about those 3 books is that the protagonist is a different nationality each time. And so what we're all seeing is that we're all the same. We all have the same struggles. Villains are not villains necessarily, not all of them. People we think are villains are actually struggling with their own thing. They're just from a different country. And we all need the same things. And I just think that the fact that the protagonists and seeing the war and their experiences through their own eyes, from different, in inverted commas, sides, it just really highlighted that.
Yeah, and that's something I really hope that I've driven home in the stories without beating my reader over the head, is that war is not a clear-cut thing. It's not goodies and baddies and winners and losers. There are good people and there are people who do horrendous things on both sides of war. And ultimately, when there's a war, no matter what side you're on or whether you're on the winning side or the losing side, everyone loses in the end. Yeah. There's just so much destruction and death and loss, and the generational consequences are horrendous. And I think that's, that's a heavy message in my books. I think I always hope I show the power of love and kindness, even just small acts of kindness to change lives, to change the world. But there's also this thing that I think we all need to know, that wars just makes everyone lose, no matter what happens in the end.
And it's also that thing where, yes, there are a few people in the world, I believe very few, who are villains. But a lot of people who we perceive as villains, you showed this very clearly in Waiting for the Storks, that sometimes people's villainous behavior, they actually think they're doing the right thing. They really believe that. They have a firm conviction that they're doing the right thing. And you look at it from your perspective and you think, how could you possibly think you were doing the right thing? But they did.
And we're all indoctrinated, aren't we? We are all indoctrinated by our parents, our teachers, our politicians. The world in which we live teaches us to think a certain way. And that's, whether it's good indoctrination or bad indoctrination, it's a reality of life and upbringing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And one of my favorite, how would I describe him? Dr. David R. Hawkins. So he wrote a lot about how would you describe it? I guess, spiritual stuff. But one of the points he makes that just has stuck with me is, he said, the human mind is not capable of telling truth from falsehood.
Yeah.
Because we are all indoctrinated and we are looking at things from a certain perspective, according to what we believe, what we've been taught. Anyway, that's something that's really, really stuck with me. And when we think about why people behave the way they do, often thinking that they're doing the right thing, it's often a kind of just a bit of a fault of our minds.
Yeah. I'll give you an example of something that really drove home to me how indoctrinated we are. I finished my schooling and my university education during the Cold War. So I finished university in 1988. And so all my history learning has been very biased towards the West. And, I'm sure there's still things that I would agree with from that education. But when I was researching for both We Are Wolves and then particularly onto Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief, and started reading diaries, like Vasily Grossman was a war correspondent, a propagandist for the Red Army, and he kept his own private diary. So there was damning stuff about the Red Army, but also such lovely stuff about the Russian people. And I read a lot of first-hand accounts of children and women during the war by a woman called Svetlana Alexievich, who did a lot of oral history and recording history. And it just changed the way I felt about so many things that I felt I've been not told this side of history. I've been given such a Western point of view. It really made me stop and think about my own prejudices. And we all like to think that we're not biased, we're not prejudiced, but we only know what we've been told, and we are all biased, we are all prejudiced. So that was really, that's one thing I've really enjoyed about researching for these historical novels, is I've been challenged in my viewpoint of history, and I've learnt so much new stuff, and I've changed my mind about some things. And I think that's really exciting. We're lifelong learners, aren't we? And we should be open to changing our minds when we know that we're wrong, or that we've only been given one side of a story.
So when you've come across or found these true stories, people's true stories, the Angel of Leningrad, the Lebensborn program, stories of those children, how do you then get to know the characters? How do you develop the characters? How do you feel your way into them? Because I know you are disciplined as a writer. And I'm just curious what that process is like, because I imagine it takes time just to percolate,
Yeah, absolutely. And so the real challenge too with writing these stories is they're all stories about lesser known aspects of World War II. And there's a reason that they are lesser known, and that's because there isn't much information about them. Right. And so seeds there in what I've found, but there aren't a lot of, like with the Wolfskinder, by the time many of those people came forward and were brave enough to say, look, I'm actually not Lithuanian, I'm German, I was a wolf child. That was when the Soviet Union had crumbled. They only felt safe to do that. And so many of those stories had been lost by that stage. People had passed away, or they were so young when they first, were living as wolf children. So a lot of those stories are lost. And the same with the story of little Sergei Oleshkov, this little child soldier, where as I started to read different accounts, it became very apparent that all those accounts actually came from one source. It was just people's variation, a bit like Chinese whispers, that it had changed. And so what I do there is I read everything I can about the topic and about those children, but it's often quite tricky. When you do a lot of reading online, every now and again a book will pop up, and it might be a rare book that you can get through books because it's out of print. So I gather everything I can. And then once I've read all the information on that topic, I then start to build up the picture around it. So for instance, with the Wolfskinder, of course, I had to learn about what happened in East Prussia during and after the war, and why the Russians did what they did, what happened in Russia during the war and the Soviet Union. So you start to build it up like a jigsaw puzzle. But with my characters, I try to form my main characters fairly early on in my research. So my characters are fictional, even though they're inspired by real things. And I do a series of activities with every main character in any book I'm writing that helps me to get to really know and love my character. If I don't know them and love them, I can't write about them. So I do a whole heap of notes and getting to know them. And then with the historical research, then I really take those characters with me. It's like I'm walking through the research, holding them by the hand, so that the things I research become relevant to them. So I can imagine what it would be like for them in those situations. So there'll be some things I think, well, I'm not going to attach that to their stories, but other things I'll just gather and wrap around them as part of their stories as I'm researching then. So it's really important for me to know my main characters partway through the research, early on in the research. Does that make sense?
That's a wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Yes, and you know your love for the character shines through. Not only your love, but your compassion for them and their experience shines through so much. Yes, so what you've described absolutely makes sense. And I mean, I guess another question is, when you're developing these characters, how much of them is you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I always put a fair dose of myself into my main character. I think I just accidentally do that, I suppose, because I need to relate, especially if it's the narrator. Like in these books, they're narrated first person present tense. So I'm telling the story through their eyes, and I think I can't help putting myself a little bit into those characters. Mm-hmm. But I think the other thing is that I always take the journey with my characters. So when I'm writing a story, wherever my characters are, whatever they're seeing, whatever they're doing, whatever's happening around them, I actually put myself there with them and imagine myself there with them. So it's like I'm living the story with them, which is how I can imagine what they're smelling, what they're seeing, what they're feeling, how their body's reacting, what they want to say, you know, if they're impulsive or if they're quivering behind a tree. So I suppose in that sense, I put myself into it. And so I feel like I experience the story with my characters as well.
Yeah.
Which is exhausting. It is really emotionally exhausting, but I honestly don't know how else to do it. I don't know how else I would write the story if I didn't do it that way.
I hadn't considered that would be emotionally exhausting, but of course it would.
And don't get me wrong, I don't mean I've suffered those things that people really suffered. No. I try to imagine and live that as much as I can with my characters.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And because that was in the back of my mind, is how can you describe things so vividly and with such clarity in terms of what somebody's feeling physically, emotionally, mentally, what they think, if it's not a part of you? I mean, it sort of has to be, because even in being able to relate so closely to those characters' experiences, it's you relating.
And I think that's too where research really matters, because when you do research, you find, like when I researched for werewolves, I felt so clever because I learned all this new stuff, but you can't put all that in the story. It'd just be like an information dump. I'm writing a novel, not a history book. But what reading around the topic so much does for you is that it gives you a picture in your mind of where your characters are in the world in which they're living. And so there might be a whole heap of stuff that you learn about the situation and what goes on that you never put in the book. But to me, it just helps me get a deeper understanding of what's going on. And I think that as well as living each moment with your character also helps perhaps to be a little bit vivid and realistic.
Yeah. So, and something you mentioned early on that, of course, you need to be aware of age appropriateness for your, your readers. And And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, part of me thinks no one, no matter their age, should ever have to go through war, right? But we all do, of all ages. And so how do you know where the line is? How do you know when it just goes past that point of being appropriate for children, the children that you're writing for?
I think that's where it really helps to know your audience, because I've raised two children myself, and they were both easily scared from stories and things. So I suppose I have them in mind often when I'm writing. And also I've been a primary school teacher. I'm not anymore, but I used to be a primary school teacher. And so I've had a lot to do with children of that age group that I'm writing for. So I know my audience well. And sometimes I find myself writing things and then I read back over it and think, oh my goodness, I can't put that in the book. Like sometimes I pull myself up after I've written it and have to rewrite, of course.
Right.
And I think there's, you know, your editor and your publisher are your safety net as well. Although there isn't really anything, I think, that I was pulled back on. I think there was just one thing I described in Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief in the Stalingrad, in the crossing of the river, that I think my editor said, I think this is a little bit graphic. Okay. But I think it's knowing my audience. And also, you know, just imagining not only children reading it, but imagine, you know, the most sensitive adult, you know, reading it. What's enough for them to understand the story but not be traumatized by it?
Well, it's interesting you should say that. Because, you know, Zara read, sorry, that's my niece. She read the books, you know, read them, loved them. I read the books and I'm going, and I'm weeping and crying. Oh, absolutely. I mean,
adult readers have been far more traumatized by these stories too. And I tell you why that is, because I've written them from the first person present tense, the narrator can only describe what they can see and what they're experiencing at the time. And so a younger reader with less world history and less life experience will just take that at face value, what the narrator's described. Whereas the more life experience and the more historical experience we have, we bring that to the story. That's the magic of a story, isn't it? We read it at the level we're ready to read it. And so adults come and they read this part that I've described and they know what's going on around here. They know what the consequences for each of the characters will be long term, all those sorts of things. So I suppose that's part of the challenge too, is writing a story that can be read at the point at which children are ready to take it too. Having said that, I wouldn't recommend children below 10 years of age read these books, so they're not appropriate.
Yep. There was a moment. There was a moment in, I think it was in Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief, where I read it, and it's where the helmet, he catches the helmet.
Oh, I know.
And he feels so he vomits in the helmet. I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that just happened. And I won't ruin it for people who are listening, because please read these books. Your life will be enriched by them. But there was a moment where I thought, I can't.
Yeah, and I think there are some things you can get away with depending on what happens after or how you describe them, or but it is difficult getting that balance. That was actually one scene that I thought I might be pulled up on, but maybe my editor had made a note, but on reading on they might have thought, oh, this is okay. But
it's the most extraordinary moment. It's fantastic, but it's just that juxtaposition of, you know, I mean, that's also the resilience of children and being in the moment and dealing with whatever is going on right now. And it was just an incredible moment.
And there's also that thing that I read often in my research with all of these stories, in that you think, how could children possibly cope with these situations? But I think you're right there. Children live in the moment. Okay, this is what's happening. I just have to deal with this. And I think that maybe is sometimes why children are more resilient than adults, because they don't even look beyond the moment. They're just, we get through this and get through that. And but also I've read a lot about how war sadly changes people. And so when people are confronted with daily disaster, that almost becomes, I want to
It's
say
normalized.
normal. I don't know whether that's the right word. That's awful. I might be using the wrong word there, but it does normalize violence, loss, and tragedy, doesn't it? Because that becomes your everyday.
Oh, and look, Katrina, with some of the work that I do with clients now, the sorts of things that they thought were normal or didn't even think to question when they were children.
Yeah.
Are sometimes just the most extraordinary things, and it's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, look, it's a part of, it's a survival strategy, isn't it? It helps people survive and get through things, and helps children cope. You know, in
and
those
that comes back. Yeah, that sort of comes back to that thing too we were talking about, indoctrination. Like, you've got indoctrination, and then you've got these extreme things that happen in war and when there are despotic regimes, and that you know, everything, if that's what you're surrounded by, and you don't know anything else, do you? How do you know what normal is for someone living in a peaceful country? Or it's really, it's horrific when you think about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when you write about it.
Yeah. The environment in which you write, in which you work, is beautiful, right? You talk about you know, the view, and you've got photos on your website, the view outside your window, the various animals that have come to visit you and come and, you know, Olive comes and sleeps by your side as you're writing. How important is your environment to your ability to write?
Oh, I think it's really important. I definitely need a space where I can be away from the world and have complete silence and big gaps of time on my own. I know a lot of people who write brilliantly, who have full-time jobs other than their writing, and they've got busy families and that, and they write in little windows and they still write amazing stories. I can't work like that. I actually really need peace and quiet, and I need chunks of time, like days and weeks, to actually live in my story, to really get it going and to write it. And I think also, certainly writing these more serious stories, it's really important to keep a balance in your life. And for me to be able to go out and walk across the hills and with my husband and have lovely chats, and I suppose sometimes I debrief or I problem solve when I'm walking, but also often it's just a matter of getting out and getting fresh air and being in this real privileged world that I live in, that sort of balances it, so you don't get too down about what you're writing, I suppose. And certainly the animals and everything create a bit of balance, bit of balance in my life. The other thing that gives me balance too is I really love writing light-hearted humour and action and fantasy, sort of not deep fantasy, but, you know, fun fiction for children. And in between these books, I've been writing a really fun, light story called the series called The Travelling Bookshop, which is just about this sweet little family that travels around in their wooden caravan that's, you know, a bookshop. And so that's also a balance, is to make sure I'm writing lovely, light, fun things in between writing the more serious things.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I remember years ago, I met we were living in Berlin. I met Bernard Schlink, who wrote The Reader, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I've got his name right. It's been embarrassing. But anyway, he said that when he's writing, he also taught at university, because he said he needed to feel his feet firmly in the real world, as well as, you know, not solely to be in his writing world, his stories world. And that was very important to him. Yeah. So when you talk about, when you mention the discipline required, just on a day-to-day thing, so when you're in the middle of writing a book, whether it's a light-hearted one, you know, The Travelling Bookshop, or whether it's and I shouldn't say, you know, the books like We Are Wolves, those 3 books they have so many moments that are lighthearted. So I don't want to give people the impression that it's all doom and gloom. It's not.
No.
There's humor, there's love, there's
Yeah.
joy in these books. That's what's so touching about them. But when you're in your groove and you've put aside chunks, weeks to write, what does your day look like? You know, when you get up, do you start writing straight away? Do you know that you no?
No, I don't write. Sorry, not. I do have a routine, yes, but I don't wake up and start writing. I'm not a morning person, so I stagger around and have breakfast and drink coffee, and I read a bit. I often read a bit, you know, while I'm having breakfast and have a slow start to the day. But 10 o'clock's my starting time. I always make sure I'm starting. Sometimes I might have some emails to deal with that I'll deal with before then or at 10 o'clock. But I try to start writing at 10 o'clock, and I will write sometimes till 4 o'clock, sometimes till 5 o'clock or 6, depending on how it goes. I'll basically write until I can't feel like I'm not concentrating anymore. And that writing, you know, inevitably there'll be emails and stuff that'll pop up, but I'm not someone who always needs to be looking at social media or my emails and that. I really do hunker down and write, and I can write for hours and realize I haven't shifted from my desk for hours. Because I do get lost in the story, and I do really need I really need that to be productive. And, you know, I mightn't produce a lot in a day's work. Sometimes I might, but other times I might write a chapter and get to the end of the day and think, oh, I could have written that in one sentence. And so I write a sentence and chapter out. And particularly with Waiting for the Storks, I think I probably would have written 500,000 words to write a 60,000 word novel there, because so often I would start writing and I'd think, oh no, I can't write that. That's too dim or too dark or getting too traumatic, or just wasn't working. I found it very hard to write, but that's, you know, got there in the end.
Yep. And so you mentioned that, you know, I think you mentioned this in your bio, when you get stuck on a plot, the next plot move or something about a character, whatever, you'll go for a walk, you'll just clear your head.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, do you I mean, you've mentioned problem solving. So is that a conscious process, or is it often the case that when you're not thinking about it and you're thinking about, I don't know, you know, the sheep over there or whatever it is, it just comes to you what needs to happen next?
It happens both ways. So sometimes I actively problem solve, and I might even get out pieces of paper and start brainstorming, or I'll talk to another friend who's a writer, or to my husband or to my son or someone, and sort of have a bit of a conversation to try and nut it out and get a bit of to and fro. But often it is like you say, where you can be struggling over something all day, and then you'll get up to make a cup of coffee. I think that's it. I'm not working for the rest of the day. You go for a walk and you're making dinner or cleaning your teeth, and you go, oh, that's it. That's the solution. So it does often come at you sideways. Yeah. Despite all my efforts to do it in a logical way. Yeah.
And are you somebody who needs to have, you know, a pen and paper beside your bed?
No, but I often, when I'm walking with my husband, and we often go for a walk at the end of the day, and we'll be walking along, and I go, oh, I've just worked out the problem, and I'll tell him, because I've got a shocking memory. So he's like my backup notebook if I haven't got it. But I do always have pen and paper with me in my handbag, or, you know, in case a solution comes to me or an idea comes to me while I'm out and about.
Oh, that's great. It just brings actually to mind a friend who lives near you. And her parents are wonderful people. Anyway, they went to the doctor, right, for something her father needed, and my friend asked him, well, did you have a list of the things that you needed to ask? And he said, no, I don't need a list. I've got a parrot, referring to his wife. I've got a parrot on my shoulder. Yeah. Anyway, that just made me laugh. So are there any questions? Because I know that you do go to schools quite a lot, and you talk to children who've read your books, and have there been many questions that have particularly struck you that children have asked, or that you've found particularly memorable?
I think I think often children, I can't think of anything that's particularly memorable. I think the thing that often children want to know is what has happened to characters that I haven't specified in the book. What's happened to them. And I love that because it shows that the characters matter to them, that you've probably asked a lot of the questions that I get asked. Yeah. But the thing of what happened to this character or that character that, have left the story at some point that they don't know about, I always love that question from children because it shows that they've engaged in the story and the characters matter to them, that they want to know. And I always say to them, that's in your power as the reader. If it hasn't been told by the writer, that's your power as the reader to decide. And I've had emails and letters written from children who've said, what happened to this character and that character? And they really want to know. But I always say, I know sometimes I think it's quite obvious what's happened to that character, but they haven't realised that. And I don't burst their bubble by saying that character's, died or they're never coming back or anything. I say that's for you to decide. And I think one thing that I absolutely love is when I get quite a few letters from children, particularly little girls, who tell me they'd like me to write a sequel, particularly to Werewolves, and they'll give me very, very specific details about what should happen in the story too. They'll basically give me the plot about different characters and who should have a romance with who and all that sort of stuff. And that's always very moving too to me because they care about what happens. But offhand, I can't think of anything that's really something that's really soft it to me.
I was and I'm not going to ruin it for readers, people who are going to read the books, but I was so relieved at the end of We Are Waiting for Storks. I didn't think that was going to anyway. I'm not good, but I was so grateful for that. Is that the ending, without sort of ruining it for anybody? Is that the ending that you had planned from the beginning, or was that changed? I wondered when I finished the book.
No, that I think. I don't know that I knew exactly. I always want these stories to have a satisfying ending for my readers. I think, especially when they're as you say, there's hope throughout and humour and loveliness throughout, but there's also sadness and loss throughout the story. So I always like to end the stories on a sense of hope and satisfaction, which doesn't mean everything works out for my characters, but I don't know that I did have it all worked out at the end of that one. I can't remember now. It just becomes so real to me. By the time it's finished writing, everything becomes so real. I sometimes even struggle to think of the difference between fact and fiction in my stories because it becomes so real. I can tell you I had a different ending planned for Werewolves. I had a very different ending planned there, which I can tell you after we're off air, Sally. So I don't spoil the real one, but
So are there any questions that you've never been asked that you wish you'd been asked?
No, I don't. I think I'm often asked the things that I think matter, things like what do I hope, what lessons do I hope young readers will take from the story, not lessons, what they will take away from it. I'm writing a novel, but there are things that I really hope I get through. I'm often asked that, and that's really important to me, that young people do get those messages about the horrors of war, and that kindness changes the world, changes lives. But I think people generally ask a good range of questions.
Yeah. is there anything else you'd like to share with us, or perhaps, share with parents of children who are reading these books before we sign off, Katrina? Or do you feel like we've...
Yeah, there's something that I've got sitting here beside me that I often like to share with children and audiences, that I just is something that is a reminder to me of what I'm writing about. And I don't know whether you'll be showing this online, Sally, but I've got this really bright crocheted doily here.
Yeah.
And so I'll go back to when I started writing Werewolves, because it's the first war story I'd written. I did a whole heap of research. I planned it really well, and I felt very competent to tell the story. And I started writing the story and got absolutely stuck. I just all of a sudden thought, hang on, this isn't an easy thing to do. I'm actually, even though I'm writing a story for children, I'm actually writing about things that happen to real people, really traumatic things that happen to real people. And I realised that I had to be very respectful in the way I told these stories and honest about it. But I couldn't make light of these things, but I had to make it accessible for children. So that was that thing of finding that balance in the story between how much to tell and how to make it accessible for children. And when I finished writing Werewolves, I got a letter from a lovely lady who lived in Perth, an older lady who lived in a retirement village, and she'd read my book, and she was telling me about her friend. She used to have this friend called Lydia, who'd lived next to her at the retirement village. And she said, I really loved reading Werewolves from the German side of things. I want to tell you about my friend Lydia. And she was a child in Russia during the war, and she was one of the stolen children who was taken and sent to Germany as a slave. And she worked on a farm as a slave during the war. She later migrated to Australia and lived a very happy, full life here in Australia. But she said, I think you should consider telling the story from the other side of things. Well, it just so happens that just the week before, I'd sent in my manuscript for Rabbit, Soldier, Angel, Thief, told from the Russian point of view. And I said, also in that story, there is a little girl called Lizabeta, a little episode with that who, like your friend Lydia, was stolen from her home in Stalingrad and sent as a slave to Germany. And to me, that was just one of those magical story moments. But it also brought home to me that these are real stories. My story is fiction, but these things really happen to real people. And so that's always like something that I keep in my mind as a responsibility, and also a privilege to share those stories. But when Rabbit, Soldier, Angel, Thief came out, I sent a copy to this lovely woman and said, I hope you feel like this goes some way to honouring your friend Lydia's story, the reality of what happened to her. And she sent back this doily to me with a beautiful letter and said, Lydia's passed away, but I got some of her things when she died. And she said, this doily has been made by Lydia. And she said, I think you should have it, not me, because now there's a connection established between you and my friend Lydia because of your story. So this is so precious to me, because it's not only reminds me of the true stories, but it's also a reminder of the connection that story gives, and how it, that magic of bringing people's lives back alive. And that this woman living in Victoria, have this connection to this little girl who was taken from her family in Russia in World War II, that there's this connection between us now. And I have her doily to show that connection. So to me, that's very special to me, that the magic of story to keep people alive, the privilege of telling stories, the responsibility when we tell those sorts of stories, but also just the joy of it connecting you with other people and their lives.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Katrina, for, creating that connection and allowing for it. And it has been a privilege for me to speak with you today, and I'm so grateful for all that you offer all of us, your readers, and for giving of your time so generously today. And thank you for all you've given us.
Oh no, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here, Sally.
And listeners and viewers, you're all a part of this conversation too. So thank you for being a part of this. And I'll really look forward to meeting with you over the waves next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.